Thank you very much for back, and it's really nice to see lots of people logging in from all around the world. So I'm sorry about the opening slide. I really don't have that big an ego. So I don't think I'm as important as perhaps Moses with the 10 commandments, but I do have 10 training principles that I want to talk about. I hope that the points that I go through are quite logical and quite usable for all of you in thinking about movement-based intervention and exercise interventions for people with dementia. So I'm a neurological physiotherapist. So in our clinic, Advanced Neuro Rehab, we see patients with all kinds of neurological conditions. So that includes dementia and Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis and stroke and brain injury. We see a lot more people with concussion now, which is good because we've got lots we can do there. We saw a lot of people with vestibular problems and dizziness, which is a large part of neurophysio that we cover. And then of course there are all the more rare neurological conditions as well. So the training principles are relevant to all these conditions. My other role part-time at university is to teach neurological physiotherapy. Now as a teaching specialist, my goal is to work with qualified physios to help them advance their practice in their journey as neurological physios. And so over the last couple of years, my role as an academic has been more in the teaching rather than the research and teaching. So I've really focused on how we can make this information usable at the coalface. So this is what I'll go through today. So at the end of last year, I published an open access paper, which you're all welcome to read. It's freely available, and hopefully I've written it in such a way that it's pretty straightforward language, and it was deliberately aimed that way. So the paper was called 10 Guiding Principles for Movement Training in Neurorehabilitation. And the reason why I wrote the paper was because no kind of written work actually existed that covered what I wanted to cover. And in the field of neurological rehabilitation, and particularly my field, the physical side of rehab, there's a lot of issues we have. The number one is we don't have a consistent terminology for what we call things. So it becomes very difficult for us to explain to each other what we're doing. So if you've got a physio, a neurophysio and a sports physio talking and an exercise physiologist, and I'm having a chat to another personal trainer or physio on the other side of the globe, we want to make sure that we understand what it is we're actually talking about. The other thing we want to do is to stimulate clinical reasoning, but also clinical reasoning in the fact that decision-making about what treatments and what interventions to choose and use when you're working with people with neurological conditions. And from there, we can develop training plans that incorporate all kinds of evidence and information that's available. We also, the aim is also to encourage innovation. In my field, a lot of the time over recent years, when we talk about innovation, we often talk about technology and virtual reality and new age games and biomechanical exoskeletons, and all these things are all fine, but actually innovation is just a way of thinking, and thinking about how to combine treatments together, how to look to the past at old interventions and figure out why they may work, and also try to develop new interventions based on new research. So we really want to encourage physios to think that way, and to be able to come up with new and creative ideas that really enhance the rehab for our patients. And then the last point I wrote the paper was also to encourage collaboration. And first of all, when we're talking about collaboration, and when you'll understand this if you do read the paper, is that Collaboration starts with the person themselves. So if I'm working with someone with dementia or I'm working with someone with stroke, it's really talking through the reasons why we're doing exercise, and actually granting permission for that person to modify and make up their own exercises because they understand what we're trying to do. As long as it's safe, we can actually come up with some really good plans. And I really enjoy it when my patients come back to me and say, well, I got that idea from you and I put this together. And then they actually come up with some fantastic ideas, which then I steal and then show to my students. So it's a really nice thing to do. Now, the other collaboration is obviously the big frustration we have as clinicians often is that we want to collaborate with researchers. So in my field, there's a lot of research going on in neuro rehab. A lot of it's very, very interesting, but not necessarily going to change practice. And a lot of the interventions we do purely because of the way research exists is it's to make clinical decisions from the evidence that we've gathered. And sometimes the evidence is there's not a lot, or it's not conclusive because there's a lot of small research studies that are very, very difficult to interpret. So what we want to do is collaborate with researchers and say, hey, this is what we try and do every day with our patients. And we've got some questions here that research may be able to answer for us. And we would like to be able to collaborate a little bit further along those lines. And I can see a bit of a trend happening that there is a strong desire amongst therapists to have a greater say in conferences and in meetings and in online meetings like this, to be able to talk about clinical content more often. So why would this be relevant to dementia? Well, it's actually pretty obvious. So as all of you know, there's plenty of research evidence for rehab in dementia. There's enough now that we can use, and we've got to now be able to go to the next step and look at, let's get started with this, and how do we get started with it? Obviously, one of the barriers we have is exercise service delivery. Are there places where you can go where you'll be able to do some form of rehabilitation exercise that's specific to your issue? And often these places don't exist. They're hard to find. They're sort of hidden. There's a bit of a service here and there's a bit of a service there. Different states around Australia have different services, different parts throughout the NHS in the UK, for example. It's a bit of postcode lottery about whether you've got a service that can provide this kind of stuff. But what we do want to do is say, have more places be able to offer this kind of therapy. The second barrier is adherence to exercise over the long term. Most of the research that we look at is trials that last for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, possibly 12 weeks. And often there's quite good results for exercise. But then what we generally find in all of this is that when the research trial finishes and the exercise program finishes, there can be a steep drop away then in performance and results. And so what we're doing is we're thinking more about exercise for the long term, exercise for the rest of your life. But then if you're going to exercise for the rest of your life, you really want to make sure you know what you're doing is beneficial, and that you're going to invest your time, your valuable time, in exercise that are worthwhile. So that comes to the third barrier, is we need more people to understand what type of exercise or interventions we need to do, and why we're doing it. And then if you understand why you're doing it, you're more likely to create your own exercises, more likely to develop and progress it on your own, or you know when to seek help to design new adaptations and progressions. And that's what all these 10 movement training principles are about. And as we also know, people with dementia have lots of movement problems. So we're always dealing with balance issues, and falls is a massive issue. Gait retraining is a huge issue. So being able to improve your walking and your ambulation inside and outside, and functionally for the things that you do. Upper limb therapy, which is not talked about as much, but is actually quite important in terms of shoulder and arm, and also hand dexterity to be able to do all the things you need to do to use the computer, the keyboard, the mouse, whether it's just even eating, using a knife and fork. So these kinds of things are trainable to certain degrees. We've got lots of people with osteoarthritis. So we've got the hips and the knees and the shoulders that are painful, and we've got issues and biomechanical issues and inflammation, and what we're working around movement changes because of that. Chronic lower back pain is really common. Neck pain is really common. And these change the way you move a lot. Vestibular dysfunction is extremely common. We know that probably 30 to 40% of people have dizziness. And we know that a large proportion of those people with dizziness, it's treatable. So there's a huge difference to change there. And then we've got some of perhaps the more strange neurological things, the movement disorders we see. So we see people with dystonia, which is involuntary muscle activity. We see people with tremor, different kinds of tremor. It's tremors, resting tremors, essential tremors, intention tremors. We see freezing of gait and freezing of other activities, like freezing of upper limb activities, or other Parkinson's symptoms. So it doesn't mean you've got Parkinson's disease, but you can have Parkinsonian symptoms. We have chorea, which is involuntary movement. We have myoclonus, restless leg syndrome, and the list goes on. So as a neurophysio, we say, oh, here's someone with chronic low back pain. Oh, they've also got a little bit of dystonia. And I see you've got a tremor when you're using a hand. So there's a lot of movement issues that we see we sort of have to juggle and try and put that puzzle together to think of ways to train and improve things. So here are the 10 movement training principles that summarize. They're nothing new. They're things that everyone knows, but it's just putting it into a usable package. Okay, so we've got number 1 was actual and predicted bodily state. Number 2 is the kind of feedback we use when we train movement. Then there's a few different kinds of learning, which is there's many different ways your brain actually learns. So what I've tried to do here is summarize 2 broad ideas that encompass a lot of learning. The first is error-based learning, which I'll talk through. And the other one is reward-based learning. And they're both really, really important. And they both need to probably happen for good learning to happen. We've got cognitive selection and planning. And this is really moving away from the old ideas that cognition is different from movement, where we now know that cognition and movement are part and parcel of the same thing. And there's lots of cognitive retraining that actually helps the way people move. Practice and variability sounds pretty obvious. That's because it is, but there's a lot of research around dose of exercise, how much you need to do, how much you vary it. We'll talk about that. Biomechanics is certainly big for us as physiotherapists, and we often work with others like orthotists and things to try and make sure that biomechanics is optimal. Physical capacity, which is around fitness and strength and conditioning. Attention, which is fascinating actually, what you actually focus on when you're exercising. And then the last one, which is beliefs and self-efficacy, probably should be number 1. If you are going to talk about perhaps what's the most important principle, probably end up being that one, but that's really, really important. Now, all of these principles I'm talking about, there's not really any ranking. There's not one that's more important than the other. They actually all relate to each other as well. One can influence the other, and then we'll discuss that a little bit further. It's important that we all understand it though, because these are the things you would consider when you're designing some exercises. So we think about the first one, actual and predicted bodily state. So what this is referring to is your brain's ability to know about where you are. So you, at the moment, when you're sitting there, you're lying there at the moment, you know where your feet are, you know where your arms are, you perhaps know that the position that you're in, even without looking. So you have this good awareness of what we call body schema. And a lot of that proprioceptive information becomes relevant. And body schema and body awareness is actually a fundamental part of movement retraining. And a lot of people have deficits in body schema. So if we really wanted to test it and look at, a lot of people really have poor awareness of knowing where their legs are in space when they're not looking at them. And they may have sensory changes that cause those sorts of issues. They may have chronic pain, which causes changes in your body schema to certain body parts. And so the accuracy and the kind of reliable information your brain gives can be altered. The good news is that body schema is very plastic. It's easy to manipulate. It's easy to wake up the brain to realize about where body parts actually are. So it's an attractive target for warm-up and priming exercises. It's an attractive starting point to try and get people to learn new movements by first being aware of those body parts. The other thing about actual and predicted bodily state is spatial awareness. And so that's the awareness of things around you. And there's a lot of this spatial cognition is very relevant to a lot of the dementias, but it's also very relevant to a lot of the other conditions I see as well. It's an awareness of knowing what's in front of you and what's behind you, your depth perception, your 360-degree awareness of what's around you. Imagine yourself standing in the kitchen and you're standing in front of the sink, and you've sort of got an awareness of how many steps to your left the fridge is. And if you turn to the right, where you might reach to go and grab the bowl that you're about to do because you're doing some cooking. That kind of accuracy of awareness affects the way you move and the way you move confidently. Now, when you're a little bit off with your judgment, it changes the way you move. And we know that has significant impact on things like gait, balance and falls risk. And spatial awareness is also a very plastic part of the brain. So being able to train visual localization, awareness of where you are, moving in relation to landmarks around you, and also, boundaries around you become an important part of that training as well. So we use those things, visual targets, we use spatial exploration, and we also use a lot of this sort of stuff as a priming activity, a bit like a warm-up exercise before you were to start. So, and at a fundamental level, actual and predicted bodily state means that every movement you're about to do, you predict before it happens, or hopefully you predict it quite accurately before it happens. And this is the reason why you can't tickle yourself, because every movement you are about to do, you anticipate it, which makes it basically less ticklish. And that also gives you a sense of ownership and knowing about movement before it happens. And predictable movement helps to enhance control, and also helps with things like chronic pain, and it helps with things like movement apprehension. So making things predictable seems like a very useful target. The second principle we talk about is feedback, and there's lots of different kinds of feedback. So when you're actually doing a movement, we can provide information that your brain can soak up and absorb to try and understand and learn from. There's two kinds of feedback that we talk about. One's knowledge performance. So when we talk about performance, that's like the quality of your movement. So if you're going to do a movement, and you want to know whether when you reach forward or when you step, whether you're getting the knee position that we prefer to be able to give you stability, it's giving you some awareness of your knee and how much it's bending. Now, we can do that by talking to you about your knee bending, or putting a mirror in front of you so you can see that, or putting a bit of sports tape on the front of your knee so you can feel that. There's different ways of providing sensory information feedback for knowledge of performance. And some of it can happen at a conscious level, and a lot of this will happen at an unconscious level as well. So those kinds of things mean that when you're learning a new skill or you're refining a new skill, feedback can be important to add in. The other feedback is knowledge of results. And that's, so if you do the movement, what is the result of the movement? So are you able to step to the target? Are you able to walk and reach the end point by a certain time? I'd be able to stand tall so you can see over the fence, so you're getting enough height. Are you able to reach accurately to grab a cup, so you've got and you're able to successfully lift that cup and bring it to your mouth and drink it? The results is there for you to see that it's actually possible. So both kinds of feedback are relevant. They both use probably different learning systems. But ultimately what we want is results. We want people to be able to successfully move, to do what they need to do. The issue we've got in physio is that there's many ways of doing a movement successfully, and some may have a preference. So For example, you might be able to walk from A to B, but you have a really big limp and you lean over to the left 30 degrees and you think, well, that's not really going to be good for your back pain and it's not going to be good for your hip. And if you keep doing that for long, it might lead to other issues. But you could also move from A to B and be a lot straighter and extend a bit more and then gradually learn a bit more stability to enable you to walk further and maybe walk without that back pain coming on earlier. So all those things become part of the feedback that we might try and provide. Now on to different types of learning. So the first is error-based learning. It seems pretty basic, but we learn from our mistakes. And when I'm talking about errors here, I'm talking about not necessarily mistakes, but more if you move and the outcome, the sensations you get from that movement don't quite match up with what was expected. So if you're trying to think about, I anticipated this sensation and I moved and I got that sensation, they don't quite match up, then you've got what's called a sensory prediction error. And when the error is not what you expected, then some learning takes place to try and refine and align those things up. So next time you move, it's a bit more accurate, it's a bit more predictable. So that's pretty much around when you practice something just by doing it, you just gradually, if you were to plot your accuracy, it's just getting better and better gradually over time. Sometimes this takes lots and lots of repetitions. So it could take hundreds of repetitions, could take thousands of repetitions. And it sounds like a lot, but when you're talking about stepping and walking, 1,000 doesn't take long for 1,000 to start to happen, is that we're trying to get a refining of the skills to happen. This kind of learning actually happens unconsciously. So most of it actually is, even if you're thinking about it or you're thinking about, I need to be more accurate, the learning's still going to happen anyway. So it's very much about the setup, knowing what to practice and then just do it. And then being able to realize that your movements are actually getting better with practice, which is motivating in itself. We do need to find the ideal challenge point because if it's too difficult and you're making very big mistakes, you're probably not, there's not a lot of error-based learning happening. If you're getting close to the target and now you're just sort of refining that target, that's probably where error-based learning comes into its own. So we have to get a good setup, allow that unconscious learning to take place, and away you go. The other thing that is reward-based learning, and reward-based learning is less research in movement control probably than error-based learning. It's really about giving meaning to a movement and selling it to the brain so that you get some kind of reward kick, some kind of kick of dopamine in the brain that says, oh, that was good. And why do we want that? This is going to help with retention. So you might learn a new skill and it might be all great and people are telling you it's great, but your brain's not really convinced it's that fantastic. It's not incentivizing you to do more of it, and it's not really going to stick. We see this in physio all the time. We get people moving really well, and then we sneak off and we follow them into the car park, and then their movement changes back and you think, oh God, all that work we've just done has just gone down the drain. That's because reward-based learning hasn't necessarily kicked in, and the behavioral and the functional level of the training hasn't transcended into real life. So in research, when we talk about reward, often in psychology, we'll talk about monetary reward. So obviously I'm not really in a position to pay a lot of my patients to incentivize them into it. But if I won the lottery, I would definitely use money as a goal to improve things. In children, you probably talk about chocolates and sweets, that motivates them. But what about for the rest of us? Well, movements that feel safe and secure are probably reward-based, where you are, or now where something used to hurt a lot now feels a bit more comfortable. And that can be quite exciting, quite a nice step forward in your movement. And also selling it to the fact that you're actually, you've taken away the threat of pain, or the threat of falling over, or the nervousness around a movement. If we can start to make that feel more safe, that's quite good. Movements that feel good. When you play sport, if you and you hit a good tennis ball, or you play golf and you drive one down the fairway, and it just feels fantastic because you got the timing right and it was just sweet. The same thing can happen with other movements as well. And that can be a selling point. being able to reach a goal, to know that your performance now is you're being executed and it's exciting. For a lot of my neurological patients, I get them to show off in front of their relatives or show off in front of their friends, because showing off is something that we do, and that's reward-based. And then what's coming at us now in terms of research is, again, the technology. So gamification, playing games, getting prizes, making lights buzz, a bit like, if you're going to the casino and you're playing the pokies, all these little things are saying you've leveled up, you're doing well. These little incentivizers we know actually work, and will probably become more of our practice over time. So reward-based learning, why do we need it? It's because it's probably the bit that will cement your skills down and keep it for longer. And the good news is, hopefully then we're choosing things that have got some level of enjoyment. It's not just some stale, boring physio exercise that is just doesn't have a lot of meaning. It's not overly pleasant, and you're not likely to keep on doing it. That does take a bit of creative thinking and a bit of negotiating. And if it's designed by the patient themselves, you can see why it makes a lot more sense. What about cognitive processes? We talk about selecting and planning issues, because with movement, these are really important. The ability for your brain to plan things. So remember I talked about before about error-based learning. You have like a sensory prediction error and a slight mistake, and you refine your skills. But what happens if you do a movement and it's just way off target, and you're just not even in the ballpark, and the movements that are coming out are not what you intend to do, and it's incredibly frustrating, and we have to try and figure out a way of training this. A lot of this comes down to more cognitive style rehabilitation. So this would be things like bringing in the body awareness, doing things like mental imagery, getting people to watch videos and reflect on the positions that they're doing, being able to talk through the decision making and the planning, making people more aware. We are often very unaware of the way we move, because that's the nature of movement. It's very much unconscious, most of it. But when we're trying to train or correct or alter something, we may need to draw your attention to how you might plan out your movements and practice them. Many of our movements have lots and lots of sequences. So you might be able to do all the sequences quite well, but then you've got to put them all together in a functional task. And that's practicing those in a functional task. The other thing is also trying to have people a bit aware of their ability. So some people underestimate what they're capable of doing, and some people overestimate it. And so we have to either push some patients or hold them back to help them find that sweet spot, and give them an idea what they should be practicing. Memory. So we talked about spatial cognition, spatial memory, the memory to be able to retrieve those movement plans before you do the movement. And decision making. So if we learn a whole bunch of skills, and now we come to the exercise where your exercise now has some choice at the beginning of it, and then you choose which movement to be able to execute a task. Let's say you're at a restaurant and you have to sort of negotiate you through walking and balancing through between some tables to get to your table where your family and friends are. You might have choice of routes you're going to take. You might have a choice of which way you're going to turn to squeeze in between two chairs. You may have to use your skills of sideways stepping, pivoting, turning, being able to stop and rebalance if someone gets up in front of you. All those sorts of skills and there's some decisions that need to be made. And we call that a lot of perception and action. So the ability to perceive something and quickly make decisions on the fly. So this is a growing area in our field, to be honest. And I must admit, in our practice, it's probably the work we've been doing with concussion, to be honest, which is a really big area of research at the moment, which is giving us some fantastic ideas about how to train spatial awareness, decision-making, and quick decision-making to improve things. And this actually comes from the idea of sports people decision-making so that they don't get a second concussion. And so it's giving us some interesting ideas about how we can train that in many other people. Okay, let's come to the other one, practice and variability. You have to do lots of practice. Now, sometimes you have to do heaps of practice and sometimes you don't. So some skills will happen quite quickly and you can move on. And sometimes you'll have to sit and just keep practicing for a longer period of time before you start to master it to a level that we need. But when you do practice, we've got to consider things like variation. If you practice things with a slight variation, we call this repetition without repetition, we find that you can improve your progressions. So you might change the direction that you're moving, the accuracy of the moving, the timing of movements, the numbers that you actually practice. So if you go to the physiotherapist and they give you 3 sets of 10, and they say, I want you to do this 10 times and I want you to have a rest. I want you to do that 2 more times after that. Well, you can ask them, why am I doing 3 sets of 10? Is it got to do with strength training here? I'm practicing a new skill here. Shouldn't I be doing 3 sets of 50? You can ask those questions, because if you're executing the movement quite well and you're not fatigued and it's not unsafe, do we need to practice something more? Do you want to do these exercises every day? And if there's these 2 exercises, do I need to do them every day so I really get my numbers up, so I make fast progress? And also, how difficult is it? Now, the difficulty of movement exercises, there can be your perceived difficulty, how you feel the exercise is, and also how actually difficult it is. Now, that's important, because you might look at a movement and think, God, that's quite a simple movement. But at the learning level, it's still quite difficult. So as a good coach, I've got to be able to say, no, stick with this one, because this is a really important skill for you to refine. I know it seems easy, but I want you to keep practicing it a little bit more so that we can use it in different ways. We talk about random and block practice. So you might do a movement over and over and over and over and over again. It's the same movement. That's block practice. Block practice is good to sort of get that movement quite quickly, but it doesn't necessarily always transfer the world as fast. So if we make things a little bit random, so I might get you to do a movement a couple of times, then do a different one, and then come back to it again, and then add in a third movement. I'm trying to make things a little bit more random with your training. Now, if we make things a little bit more random, there is some evidence that it may help with carryover from session to session and help you to progress quicker over the long term. It's because it's basically making it a little bit more brain power. It's giving you a little bit more problem solving, and it's probably adding in some of those other things like reward-based learning and other elements. Repetitions is big. So in my world in neurophysio, they're absolutely inundated with repetitions, because researchers can give it, we can give it a number, you know, and they talk about dose. I don't like the word dose, because I think of medicines basically when I think about dose. But dose, they talk about, you know, how many do you have to do? So often with things like upper limb dexterity training, you may have to do hundreds of them, and you start to see the movements gets better. But you can see there's issues we've got to work around, like fatigue. And what if the muscles get tired? What if you get motor fatigue, which is coming more from the central nervous system? What if your attention's dropping away? So we've got to be a bit creative with that. And the other thing is rest intervals. So you can overdo it. And also when you rest is probably when all the magic happens, all the consolidation happens. Sleep, we know, is really important. If someone's not sleeping well and we're going through a skill acquisition phase of their training, it's not going to be as good. And so if we can help get sleep under a little bit more control, if we've got more frequent rests, then we may find that people can make much faster progress. And there's no doubt about it. Some people are super motivated, or the people around them are super motivated, and they don't necessarily get a lot of rest. As a coach, I give them permission to have that rest and tell them that's important, so that they can then structure their own programs and know this day I'll do that exercise, this day I'll have a rest from that exercise, and it all starts to make sense. We've also got to consider, like, are you doing repetitions for strength? So are you trying to build muscle bulk and power to help you get up out of the chair? Or are you looking at endurance? So we're looking at sort of calf raises or push off with gait so that you can walk, 2 kilometers and you're starting to move into the endurance phase. There's a lot of things to consider when you think about how much to do of each exercise. Biomechanics, it seems pretty straightforward, but we've got to consider how your joints move, your muscle activity and alignment, and how to try and improve the mechanics. Sometimes we can get some quick wins by actually changing the mechanics or add in that body schema, the awareness of how your mechanics changed to make improvements in movement. So whether it's to just demobilize someone's shoulder so that they can reach a little bit higher, to be able to work through their hips so that they can stride out a little bit further, those kinds of things need careful consideration. I can sometimes really loosen up someone's lower back and their hips, and they feel wonderful, and then they get up and they're really wobbly because I haven't given them any control. So it's a combination of getting a little bit more movement, a little bit more control. Do I need some kind of supports for some movements? Do we need braces for certain muscle groups? And some people don't like the idea of braces, but they can be very enabling at times. They enable people to do a lot more, and we get a lot more benefits out of having those. And we would then consult with people like orthotists who can custom make these things. Because if they're not well fitted, they're not comfortable, they're not lightweight, they're not exactly what we need at your stage of your movement training, then it's not going to work. Some of the movements we try and freeze up. We talk about freeze the range of movements to try and make things simple. We might try and keep your knee straight while you move your hip. We try and say, well, lock in your elbow while you're reaching forward. But then sometimes we provide guidance. So in neurophysio, there's a lot of facilitation, we call it, which is active assisted movements, where you can do the movement, but it just needs some guidance about direction, maybe a bit more anti-gravity support, and also some awareness of movement performance to be able to kickstart that. So facilitation becomes important. And there's also, we've got to consider your musculoskeletal limits. So some people just have stiff hips, and it's not really going to change that much. Some people's ankles have got sort of slight contractures, and I'm not going to get some more dorsiflexor range because it's just not going to happen. So we've got to then come up with adaptation and workarounds for those kinds of things. And for some people, it's trying to decide is whether can we get a bit more movement or realistically can't we, or should we do a little bit of try and error to see whether we can, and then make some decisions. So we're always working around those sorts of limits for biomechanics, but it becomes quite important. Physical capacity is the one you hear about the most, particularly in dementias, because we know if you get fit, it reduces people's risk of dementia. If you have dementia and you're doing some kind of aerobic exercise, it's probably neuroprotective for your dementia. We know this kind of stuff. We also know that certain kinds of intensity, and we haven't refined it yet, but we know that certain kinds of intensity aerobic exercise not only gets you fitter, will probably enhance your brain's capacity to learn. So if you're doing some kind of aerobic fitness and learning a skill at the same time, it might make the learning of the skill more effective. So that's an exciting area that we'll see a lot more happening. Physical capacity also deals with strength. So we're talking at neuromuscular conditions. We've got to deal with upper and lower motor neuron syndromes. We've got to deal with often people who are very weak. And when you're dealing with very weak muscles and very weak movements, it's come out with ideas of how do we kickstart it? How can we get enough to make a difference? Muscle strength is also about power. When do you need to do muscle activity and actually make it fast and explosive power so that it's much better for standing up? It's much better for walking or leaping over a puddle or being able to stand up on your tippy toes. That kind of power-based training is different from more an endurance state or a holding kind of training. Unfortunately, each training needs to be trained specifically. I can't give you a generic exercise that covers it all. You're going to have to do specific training. Cardiovascular fitness, obviously, I've talked about. Exercise tolerance. So some people are going to have fatigue. Some people are going to have limitations with their weakness. Some people will have cardiovascular limitations because of cardiac issues. They might have chronic lung conditions. We have to work around what is actually possible. Our aim is not to completely exhaust you and then you're wiped out for 3 days, because then we're not going to get much training done. So we have to have a starting point. What's happened over recent times is these wrist-worn heart rate monitors have been absolutely fantastic to help guide people, to give some basic guidance about heart rate zones for different activities. It does help people from overdoing it and also helps people to work at intensities that we like. A lot of people have autonomic issues, a lot of our populations that we deal with. So What does your blood pressure do? What does your heart rate do when you exercise? Does it creep up as it's supposed to, or does it stay stagnant? I'm doing an exercise program with someone who's got a pacemaker, and so there's going to have different requirements. What about body temperature control? Just some people sweat a lot, some people don't sweat. Some people, they're on different medications that will affect the way their body temperature is actually controlled. We're coming into summer here in Australia. It's going to have an enormous impact on the way we design some of the exercise for our patients, because, well, it might be 40 degrees outside and it might be close to that for a few weeks, and we're not going to be able to go outside and do those. We have to think about air conditioning. We have to think about hydration. All those kinds of things become important. If you deal with people with a lot of the patients with dementia, a lot of patients with Parkinson's do have autonomic issues that are just not talked about. So if you're seeing a physiotherapist or an exercise physiologist, we do have to sort of start a bit slow, monitor a little bit carefully before we really get going into a long-term program. So we test things out to see how you get along, because there's quite a few things to consider there. And some people actually get adverse reactions to different kinds of exercises. So you might get, some people get exercise-induced headaches. Some people find that they have, some people with chronic fatigue syndrome, for example, really may not tolerate exercise at all, and really be exhausted for many days or even weeks after a session. So there's some care that we have to work around and that sort of stuff. And of course, I don't have to tell you guys about neuroprotection, but if we can find a starting point, if we can find some way of getting cardiovascular work into you, it's probably, one of the best drugs you can take. So I've got some people who are almost quadriplegic, and I think, how do I get them to do active exercises? And they might just use an arm ergometer, and we can strap their arms on. They can actively use their shoulders. We can see them get their heart rate up. We can build up their tolerance. And this is the only active exercise they're capable of doing. And that's the one we're going with. And you see changes in their energy levels. You see changes in their sleep. So it can be very, very exciting. In Australia, exercise physiologists have really started to arrive. And so there's more exercise physiologists available for working with neurological populations, even those with degenerative conditions. So it's nice for us as neurophysios to work with exercise physiologists to really take people's rehab to the next level. So collaborative working with exercise physiologists is absolutely fantastic at the moment. And it's really changed my practice. Attention. Hopefully I've still got your attention. So attention is considering things like, when you do a movement, what are you actually focusing on? So are you focusing on the target that you're trying to do? Are you focusing on the conversation you're having with someone else? Are you focusing on your foot and the sensations behind your toes? Are you really focusing on that pain that's in your hip? So you can internalize your focus into the body, or you can externalize your focus into where you're going, what you're trying to do. A basketball player, when he's taking a free shot at the foul line, could be focused on the ring and just shoot like he does in practice and try and get the goal. Or they could start to focus on a body part, like, I've got to make sure I extend my elbow, or I push upwards, and they start thinking internally. Now, with a lot of movements, if you start thinking internally, you can start mucking things up a little bit often. So we find that when we're learning and we're thinking about our body parts, that's a good place to start. But often with our training, we need to externalize our focus. So the best way to actually think of it is like choking in sport. So a golfer, if they start thinking about their rotation in their shoulder or their weight on their front leg, they can start to really muck things up, and they can really start to alter their performance, because what's happening is they're moving away from the brain processes they have established that have made them so good. Now, we are all elite with many of the movements we do. We're very elite at shifting our weight and sitting. We're elite with we walk. We've got very finite skills that we've established. When we're trying to get back some of those skills, when we've lost them, we need to try and use often external focus to try and get those to happen. So as a good coach, as a physio, I've got to help people try and figure out when they do a movement to change what they're thinking of and say, when you do this exercise, I want you to focus on this. And then that's quite a simple thing that they can take on. What about when you're doing a movement and you actually don't want to focus on any of that? You actually want to focus on something else. So for example, you want to be able to walk and carry a cup of tea, or you might want to walk and carry a pint of beer without spilling it. And that's very important. So what you want to be able to do is walk and focus on balancing with your hand. That's a dual task. You also may want to walk and balance while you're talking to someone else on the phone. You may need to look down and check your mobile phone. We had a patient the other day where he's really progressing quite well with his walking and his balance, but he came into our practice, and because we've got to do the COVID check-in now with your QR code with your mobile phone. So he got up the stairs, he's doing quite well. He walked in, but then he looked down to get his phone ready for the QR code, and that's when he lost his balance. So that dual tasking becomes really important. So what we've got to decide on is when you start to become more accomplished in a movement, when do you start to add on the other things? Or should you start to add on the other things because it may not be safe? And a lot of those are very clinical decisions that you've got to come up with as to how good do we need to get, or how much do we push things without risking things like injury? Because obviously we don't want to fall over and break our hip or something like that, which obviously not going to be good for your rehab. So ability is important, safety is important, context, and a little bit of trial and error we can try. So attention is a big part of movement training. Then the final one I want to talk about is beliefs and self-efficacy. So consider what do you truly believe? What do you think you're capable of doing? When you do an exercise program, what's the end point? Are you hopeful that you'll get what you want out of the exercise? Do you trust that physiotherapist or that personal trainer or that person in front of you is giving you good advice? Have you got any skepticism about whether it's actually going to be helpful? I mean, is this just some sort of fancy treatment that seems like a bit of a money-making scheme? I don't really trust it. I'm not sure. I'll try it out, but I'm not convinced. If you're not convinced, that's quite important. So as a clinician, we need to try and explain where it sits with and why it might be worth investing a bit of time into it. Will it be useful? Do you have any concerns about it? And we can actually inquire about this as early as possible. And when you're doing a program, see how you're still feeling about it, because we can alter and adjust a program based on those things. Because if you don't believe in something, it's really not going to work very well. That's the bottom line. And hopefully you or the people around you supporting you have a good faith and good belief to commit to something, especially when exercise programs aren't going to give you anything amazing in a very short amount of time. It's really a long-term process. So we want people to get involved in their decision as soon as possible from the start, hopefully. And I think physios and in the area of chronic pain has led the way too, is really to talk about what do people actually believe. You know, they say, I went to the doctor and I've had an MRI of my lower back and it says that it's all degenerated and it's terrible and I'm not going to be able to, I shouldn't really bend my spine forward because my back, and I'm going to pop a disc in my back, and all this stuff that's misinformation. It makes them fearful of movement. It might be completely inaccurate. So we've got to tease out those little beliefs that may be sitting there and correct them accurately if we can. And that becomes a large part of our practice. So beliefs is important, and also your confidence. So you might be actually moving quite well, progressing quite well with your exercises, but your confidence is still low. Some people's confidence might be exploding and their performance is not quite there yet, and then they may be at risk of overdoing it. So matching up confidence levels with your performance levels is something we can measure. And in Australia, with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we're doing a little bit more tracking of people over time. So if we're looking at outcome measures, some of the things that we do is we really want to look at people's confidence and their self-efficacy as one of the major and primary outcome measures in community neurophysio. It is probably the most important measure that we have. So that's the 10. Now I'll just explain to you where this fits. With my students at the moment, these are physiotherapists studying neurophysio. We use the 10 principles and we say to our students, you've just done a session with a patient. In the 10 principles, how do they rank? What were you focused on in that particular session? So, for example, they may say, with this session, we were quite high focused on bodily state, actual bodily state. And there was a lot about reward-based learning. And we spent a lot of time discussing and coming up with a plan to get the biomechanics correct. Now, they may come in 2 days later, or they may come in next week, and those things change a little bit. But what we're trying to do is get our physios and our patients thinking about, what's the purpose of this exercise? This exercise is very heavily weighted towards getting me to building my physical capacity, maybe. Or I'm really focused on being able to sustain my attention while I execute these tasks. Or we spend a lot of time focused on your beliefs and self-efficacy because we know that's really important. It'll chop and change, and we need to recognize there's lots of elements to the exercises we give. So that's one thing we're working on at the moment, to see how it helps clinical reasoning, decision making. And also the other thing that we think about is, if you've got a new piece of technology, let's say we've got a new whiz-bang virtual reality training program, you'll all read about it, they'll all come to us in the next few years. Well, we could look at that training device and say, okay, does this training device help us with things like bodily state? Will it provide different kinds of feedback? Will it enable some kind of error-based or reward-based learning? Is it built into the software? Will it help with some of the more cognitive selection planning elements to the exercise? Will it have cognitive training parts to it? Will it record how much practice I do and variability? Will it keep some kind of record of the amount and the dose of exercise? Does it have influence in the quality and the biomechanics of the movement? Physical capacity, is it recording that? Is it incentivizing that? Can we change the attentional focus during exercises? And is it also trying to build up self-efficacy? If you're going to be innovative, you could then look at these sorts of technologies and say, does it meet a lot of these requirements, or are those requirements adjustable? Because that's what physiotherapists think about. So we better make our new fancy device acceptable to them and their patients. So that's one thing we're hoping to be able to do through some of my colleagues at Flinders Uni. So the training principles can change. They could change within the day. You could do some warm-up exercise in the morning, which is very much around body schema and balance. And then later on in the day, you might do some stuff which is very much around physical capacity building. So it's going to vary. You need to know why you're doing the exercises and when you're doing them, and then you're more likely to actually do them. Day to day, they can change. Week to week, they can change. As you start to get more confident, we can then focus on other areas. Once you build up your capacity with your strength, we can then focus on your balance. Once you then focus on your balance, we can then focus on your dual task attention. So those things can progress over time. And then there'll be lifelong adaptations. Things will change over time. People improve, people get worse, people have setbacks. We may go back to similar exercises again, but we tweak them. And because we've gone back to the similar exercises, you know exactly why we're doing them, and you're more likely to get started with them again. So we do have some challenges. Often one of the challenges is trying to find the correct challenge point. That's trying to find exercises that are not too difficult, not too hard, or give you a little bit of choice. Motivation's always in any exercise program. I don't care whether you're talking about children, you're talking about elite athletes, or you're talking about people with dementia. Motivation will be an issue. So we need to monitor your perceived beliefs. Some people we need to push a little bit, and that's our job. Sometimes we've got to hold them back. So the other thing is common here. I'm actually going to write a blog piece about this. Is too many exercises. You come back from the physio and you've got 12 exercises. 3 weeks ago, you went to another physio from the same place and they gave you a different 8 exercises. Now you're up to 20 exercises. And then 2 months before that, when you were rehabbing from your knee problem, they also gave you 10 exercises. Now you're up to 30 exercises. Which of these 30 exercises should you do every day? Which one's more important than the others? Which ones will I be focusing on more as I improve? You need a clean out of your exercises, basically. You've got too many. And we've got this little ground rule in our clinic. We give people 3, maybe 4 exercises tops. That's it, no more. And those exercises might be A, B, and C. A is pretty easy, B is a bit challenging, and C is even more challenging. We give you choices about whether you're going to do A, B, and C. It's up to you. When you're feeling good, you might do C, but you might just do A for the first 5 days because that's what you're more confident with. a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of choice. You know exactly why you're doing the exercises, and there's not too many of them. And if there's not too many of them, you're going to do more of those 4 exercises, which means you're going to increase your dose. And this is one of our biggest problems with interventions, is trying to get dose into people. So that becomes important. So that's why perhaps not enough dose, less is more sometimes. So have a good, it's spring here in Australia. We have a good spring clean out of your exercises. Try and come out with some priorities. Trying to keep it real. A lot of our exercises is not spectacular. We're just keeping you going with what's important for you. For some people, it's improving. For some people, it's just keeping you mobile, keeping you at a level that you really want to, and fighting hard for you to maintain your identity. And a lot of that is motivating in itself. There's also preferences. Do you do the exercise at home with support and supervision? Do you do it in the clinic? Are you doing it in small groups, gymnasiums, semi-supervised by personal trainers, exercise physiologists, hydrotherapy in the pool? Are you going where it's more social and you get to hang out and meet your friends or meet other people? And those are all very important parts. So it's trying to work out, when I see a patient, how often you go in the gym, when do you go to the pool, when you're doing that walking group, how often you go in the clinic, and start to think about, okay, design these exercises so that we know what we're trying to do for the long term. Measuring success. How do you measure success if someone's got a progressive neurological condition? So if their performance is declining because their condition is progressing, what we try and measure is we try to measure things like function. We measure things like quality of life. And like I said, we measure things like self-efficacy as by far the most important things. So if we were doing a report to an insurer or National Disability Insurance Scheme here in Australia, we would report on self-efficacy, quality of life, some mobility scores, and then say we're monitoring that, and that's that, because they're the most important things to the patient. Yes, we talk about goals, but that's part of it. And I think we talk a little bit too much about goal setting sometimes, because if we're not making a goal based, we really are struggling in the first place. Injury setbacks. There's always going to be a setback. There's going to be a fall, an injury, an overloaded, a tendinopathy, problems with you've been unwell, you've just had your vaccination, you feel unwell for 3 days, all these things, that little bit of tweaking, a little bit of guidance, and that becomes important. And it's important for the team around you to realize what the adjustments we need to have. And if we expect those, then sometimes they're not so devastating. Particularly if we can come back to a program that gets you back in the groove again as soon as possible. So in summary, they're the 10 movement training principles. They all relate to each other in different ways. Hopefully after talking today, they make sense to you. What we want people to do is to think about them. When you're doing a bunch of exercise, perhaps consider where these 10 principles fit in relation to exercise you may be doing, and ask lots of questions. And so I'm hopeful that we will use this, and I'm starting with physiotherapists, but we can use this more with patients and their confidence levels in decision making, and we can also use it to see if researchers think, okay, are these important things we should consider as well.